In a quiet little town surrounded by green hills and peaceful countryside, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The townsfolk were simple people who valued their traditions deeply, and nothing brought them together quite like Sunday mornings at St. Mary's Church. The old stone church stood proudly in the center of town, its tall bell tower casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets. It had been there for generations, a place where families prayed, celebrated weddings, and mourned losses. Every week, nearly everyone in town attended the service, men in their best suits, women wearing modest dresses, and children trying hard not to fidget during Father O'Connell's sermons. Among these regular attendees was Emily, an 8-year-old girl with bright eyes and a curious nature. She sat quietly with her parents near the middle of the church, often clutching her mother's hand as the hymns echoed through the vaulted ceilings. At first glance, she seemed like any other child, but something unusual began happening that caught the attention of those around her. It started subtly, a slight movement of her finger while she listened to the prayers. Then, one Sunday, it became impossible to ignore. As Father O'Connell read from the Bible, Emily suddenly leaned forward and pointed straight down at the floor beneath her pew. Her arm stretched out stiffly, her small finger trembling as if drawn by some invisible force. Her parents exchanged puzzled glances, thinking it might just be a phase or a distraction. They gently pulled her hand back onto her lap, whispering reminders to stay still. But Emily didn't stop. Week after week, the same thing happened. No matter how many times her parents scolded her softly or tried to distract her with coloring books, Emily would point at the exact same spot on the floor. Sometimes she did it once. Other times she repeated the motion again and again, her face pale and her lips pressed tightly together. There was no giggling or playful mischief in her expression. It was almost as if she were trying to tell them something important, something she couldn't put into words. The congregation began to notice. Some thought it was cute, assuming Emily was simply bored or imagining things. Others weren't so sure. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who always sat in the front row, whispered to her neighbor, "Do you think she sees something we don't?" Her question lingered in the air, planting seeds of doubt and curiosity among the worshippers. What could possibly make a child behave this way? Was it a trick of the light? A figment of her imagination? Or was there something more? Father O'Connell, too, grew concerned. After one particularly unnerving service, he approached Emily and her parents outside the church. Kneeling down to her level, he asked kindly, "Emily, my dear, why do you keep pointing at the floor? Is there something wrong?" Emily blinked, up at him, her big brown eyes filled with confusion and fear. Without saying a word, she shook her head and clung tightly to her mother's skirt. Whatever it was, she couldn't, or wouldn't, explain. As days turned into weeks, the mystery only deepened. People talked about it in hushed tones after services, speculating wildly. Some joked nervously that maybe the church mice were staging a rebellion. Others wondered aloud if the building itself held secrets hidden within its ancient walls. But one thing was certain. Emily's strange behavior had planted a seed of unease in the hearts of even the most skeptical townsfolk. Little did they know, the truth lay closer than anyone imagined, and it was far darker than anyone could have guessed. 2 ways the weeks went by, Emily's behavior became harder to ignore. What had started as an occasional oddity soon turned into a recurring pattern that left the congregation buzzing with curiosity and unease. Each Sunday, without fail, she would point at the same spot on the floor beneath her pew. Her gestures grew more insistent, almost frantic, as if whatever was compelling her couldn't wait any longer. The whispers among the townsfolk grew louder, spreading like ripples in a pond after a stone is thrown. At first, people tried to brush it off as childish antics. "Kids will be kids," Mrs. Anderson said one afternoon while chatting with her friends over tea. But even she couldn't hide the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Others weren't so quick to dismiss it. Mr. Harper, a retired schoolteacher who always sat near the back of the church, leaned closer to his wife during one service and muttered, "It's not normal, Mary. She doesn't look like she's playing around." His wife nodded silently, her gaze fixed on Emily's trembling hand as it hovered above the wooden planks. The speculation only intensified when some parishioners began noticing subtle changes in Emily's demeanor outside of church. At school, she seemed perfectly fine, laughing with her classmates, raising her hand eagerly during lessons, and running around the playground like any other child. Yet every Sunday, as soon as she stepped into St. Mary's, something shifted. Her cheerful smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet apprehension. Some wondered if the atmosphere of the old church unsettled her, but others believed there was more to it. One particularly unsettling Sunday, Emily's actions took a dramatic turn. Midway through Father O'Connell's sermon about forgiveness and redemption, she suddenly stood up from her seat, startling those nearby. Her small frame wobbled as she stretched her arm out, her tiny finger jabbing forcefully at the floor. This time, she didn't stop after a few seconds. Instead, she kept pointing, her breathing shallow and uneven until her mother pulled her back down onto the pew. Tears streamed down Emily's face as she buried her head in her hands, refusing to speak for the rest of the service. Afterward, a group of concerned parishioners gathered outside the church to discuss what they had just witnessed. "Something's wrong with that girl," whispered Mrs. Lewis, clutching her Bible tightly against her chest. "She's either scared or, I don't know, seeing things." Her voice trailed off, leaving the others to exchange uneasy glances. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but the idea that Emily might be experiencing something supernatural lingered heavily in the air. Father O'Connell, feeling increasingly troubled, decided to address the matter directly. He approached Emily and her parents after the service, offering them a warm smile meant to put them at ease. "Emily," he said gently, kneeling beside her, "can you tell me why you keep pointing at the floor? Are you trying to show us something?" For a moment, Emily hesitated, her wide eyes searching his face as though looking for answers herself. Then, shaking her head vigorously, she burst into tears and clung to her mother's leg. Her silence only fueled the growing mystery. Rumors began swirling faster than ever. Some suggested the church might be haunted, a theory quickly dismissed by the more practical-minded members of the congregation. Others recalled old stories about St. Mary's history, tales passed down through generations of strange occurrences and unexplained events. A few even joked nervously about hidden treasure buried beneath the floorboards, earning nervous laughter from the crowd. Despite the light-hearted attempts to diffuse the tension, uneasiness settled over the town like a thick fog. Parents whispered warnings to their children about staying away from certain parts of the church. Even those who prided themselves on being logical found themselves glancing suspiciously at the worn wooden floors during services, wondering if they were sitting above secrets better left undisturbed. Meanwhile, Emily's mother, Sarah, wrestled with her own fears. She knew her daughter wasn't prone to lying or seeking attention, which made her behavior all the more baffling. One night, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, Sarah confided in her neighbor, Detective Mark Harris. Over cups of steaming coffee, she recounted everything, from Emily's nightmares to her inexplicable actions in church. By the time she finished speaking, Mark's brow was furrowed in deep thought. "I'll look into it," he promised, sensing that this wasn't just a case of childhood imagination run wild. Little did anyone realize his investigation would uncover truths far darker and more profound than anyone could have imagined. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. Her mind kept replaying the events of the past few Sundays, her daughter's trembling finger pointing at the floor, and the whispers she'd overheard from other churchgoers. Was Emily trying to tell them something, or was it just a child's overactive imagination? The questions swirled endlessly in her head, leaving her restless and uneasy. She knew one thing for certain: whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. The next morning, Sarah decided to confide in someone outside her immediate circle, someone who might have a clearer perspective. That person was Detective Mark Harris, a longtime neighbor and friend of the family. Mark had lived in the town for years, earning a reputation as a thoughtful and fair-minded man. Though he no longer worked full-time for the police department, his instincts remained sharp, and Sarah trusted him implicitly. She caught him early on Monday morning as he was tending to his garden. "Mark?" She began hesitantly, clutching her hands together nervously. "Do you have a minute? There's something I need to talk to you about." He straightened up, brushing dirt off his jeans, and nodded. "Of course, Sarah. What's going on?" Over cups of steaming coffee at his kitchen table, Sarah poured out her heart. She described Emily's strange behavior in detail. The pointing, the tears, the way her cheerful demeanor vanished every time they entered the church. "It's like she's trying to show us something," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "But when we ask her about it, she won't or can't explain." Mark listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. "You're right to be concerned," he said finally. "This doesn't sound like typical childhood behavior. Have you noticed anything else unusual? Any changes at home or school?" Sarah shook her head. "No, nothing. At home she's perfectly fine, happy even. It's only in the church that she acts this way. And it's always the same spot on the floor beneath our pew." Mark's expression grew more serious. "Do you think it could be related to the building itself? Maybe there's something hidden under the floorboards?" He didn't say it aloud, but the thought crossed his mind. Old churches often held secrets, some darker than others. Sarah's eyes widened. "You mean, like something buried there?" The idea sent a chill down her spine, but deep down it felt like the missing piece of the puzzle. "What should we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark stood up, determination etched on his face. "First, we need to approach Father O'Connell. If anyone has access to the church records or knows its history, it's him. We'll also need permission to inspect the area where Emily keeps pointing. If there's something under the floor, we'll find it." Later that day, Mark accompanied Sarah to the rectory, where Father O'Connell greeted them warmly. After explaining the situation, Sarah watched anxiously as the priest's expression shifted from surprise to concern. "I've seen Emily's behavior myself," he admitted. "At first I thought it was just a phase, but now—" He trailed off, glancing toward the church with a troubled look. "I understand your concerns," Father O'Connell continued after a moment. "If there's any possibility that something is amiss, we must investigate. St. Mary's has stood here for over a century, and while I trust its sanctity, I can't ignore what's happening." With the priest's blessing, Mark arranged for a discreet inspection of the church later that week. On Saturday morning, armed with flashlights, tools, and a sense of cautious curiosity, they gathered near Emily's usual pew. The air inside the church felt heavier than usual, almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. As Mark knelt to examine the floorboards, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something significant. "Let's start here," he said, pointing to the exact spot where Emily always directed her gaze. Using a crowbar, he carefully pried up the wooden planks, revealing loose dirt beneath. The discovery sent a jolt of unease through everyone present. Dirt, in a place where solid foundation should have been. Father O'Connell crossed himself, murmuring a quiet prayer. Sarah clutched her arms tightly around herself, her heart pounding. Whatever lay beneath the surface, they all sensed it was tied to Emily's mysterious actions, and perhaps to secrets long forgotten by the town. As shovels dug deeper into the earth, the weight of anticipation hung heavy in the air. None of them could have guessed how profoundly this investigation would change their lives forever. The moment the first shovel broke through the loose dirt beneath the floorboards, a strange hush fell over the group. The air inside the church seemed colder, heavier, as if the ancient stones themselves were holding their breath. Detective Mark Harris worked carefully, his movements deliberate, while Father O'Connell stood nearby, clutching his Bible tightly. Sarah watched anxiously, her arms wrapped around herself as though trying to ward off an invisible chill. As they dug deeper, the soil grew darker and denser, packed tightly, as though it had been disturbed long ago. Mark paused for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow, and glanced at the others. "This isn't natural," he muttered. "Someone put this dirt here on purpose." His words hung in the air, unspoken fears taking shape in everyone's minds. What, or who, had been buried beneath the church? After several tense minutes of digging, The tip of the shovel struck something solid. A metallic clang echoed through the silent church, sending shivers down their spines. Mark knelt down and brushed away the remaining dirt with his hands, revealing a rusted metal box. Its surface was tarnished with age, its edges corroded, but it was unmistakably man-made. The sight of it sent a wave of unease rippling through the small group. Father O'Connell stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly. "What is that? Why would someone bury something like this under the church?" No one had an answer. Mark carefully lifted the box out of the hole, cradling it as though it might fall apart at any moment. It was heavier than it looked, its weight suggesting it contained more than just dust and decay. Back inside the rectory, they placed the box on a sturdy wooden table and examined it closely. The lock was rusted shut, but after some effort, Mark managed to pry it open using a small crowbar. Inside, they found a collection of old, yellowed documents, brittle photographs, and faded letters tied together with fraying string. The handwriting on the papers was delicate yet firm, the ink smudged in places but still legible. Mark unfolded one of the letters cautiously, squinting to read the cramped script. As he scanned the contents, his expression darkened. This is serious," he said quietly, passing the letter to Father O'Connell. The priest adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud, his voice growing increasingly troubled. The letter was written by a man named Thomas Reed, who identified himself as a former caretaker of St. Mary's Church. In painstaking detail, he described a series of disturbing events that had taken place decades earlier. According to Thomas, certain members of the congregation had used the church as a front for illegal activities, money laundering, blackmail, and even worse crimes. He claimed to have uncovered evidence of these misdeeds and confronted those involved, only to face threats and intimidation in return. One passage stood out in particular. "They think I'll stay silent, but I cannot let this evil go unpunished. If anything happens to me, know that the truth lies hidden where none will dare to look. Trust no one, not even those who wear the cloth." The words sent a shiver down Father O'Connell's spine. He glanced up at Mark and Sarah, his face pale. "This is unimaginable." Sarah reached for one of the photographs tucked inside the box. It showed a group of men standing near a freshly dug patch of earth behind the church. Their faces were grim, their expressions hardened, and one man held a shovel casually over his shoulder. Though the image was grainy and faded, there was no mistaking the implication. Whatever secrets Thomas Reed had uncovered, they had been buried, literally and figuratively, along with him. Mark studied the photo intently, his jaw tightening. "This confirms it," he said grimly. "Thomas didn't just disappear, he was silenced. And whoever did this went to great lengths to cover their tracks." The gravity of the discovery settled over them like a thick fog. For years, the townsfolk had believed Thomas Reed's disappearance was an accident, or perhaps a voluntary departure. Now, staring at the evidence before them, they realized the truth was far darker. Someone in their community, or maybe even within the church itself, had played a role in hiding these crimes. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up another letter. "Emily knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Somehow, she knew." Her words echoed in the quiet room, filling the space with a mixture of awe and dread. How could an 8-year-old girl sense something so deeply buried? Was it intuition, coincidence, or something else entirely? For now, the answers remained elusive. But one thing was clear. The secrets hidden beneath St. Mary's Church were about to come to light, shaking the very foundation of the town and forcing everyone to confront the darkness they had ignored for far too long. The discovery of Thomas Reed's letters and photographs sent shockwaves through the small group gathered in the rectory. Each new detail they uncovered painted a grim picture of betrayal, greed, and violence that had festered beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful town. Detective Mark Harris felt a growing sense of unease as he pieced together the timeline of events. The more he read, the clearer it became that Thomas hadn't simply vanished. He had been silenced, his warnings buried along with him. Father O'Connell sat heavily in a chair, his face pale and drawn. "How could this happen under our very Noses, he murmured, staring at the faded photograph of the men standing near the freshly dug earth. We're supposed to be a community of faith, yet this. His voice trailed off, heavy with guilt and disbelief. He glanced toward the church, its towering walls now feeling like a prison rather than a sanctuary. For decades, the congregation had prayed within those walls, oblivious to the sins hidden beneath their feet. Sarah, clutching one of the brittle letters in her hands, couldn't stop thinking about Emily. Her daughter's strange behavior suddenly made a chilling kind of sense. She knew, Sarah repeated softly, her voice trembling. Somehow she knew there was something wrong, but how? She's just a child. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at Mark. What does this mean for her? For all of us? Mark set down the documents and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I don't have all the answers yet, he admitted, but I think Emily might have some kind of connection to Thomas Reed, or maybe to the place where he was buried. Children sometimes pick up on things adults miss. Their imaginations are different. They see the world differently. He hesitated, before adding, or maybe it's something else entirely. Either way, we need to find out. With renewed determination, Mark suggested they search the area shown in the photograph, the cluster of oak trees behind the church. If Thomas Reed's remains were truly hidden there, it would provide undeniable proof of the crimes described in his letters. Father O'Connell agreed, though reluctantly, knowing that disturbing such a site would be emotionally and spiritually taxing for everyone involved. Early the next morning, armed with shovels and flashlights, the group ventured behind the church. The ancient oaks stood tall and imposing, their gnarled roots twisting across the ground like frozen lightning bolts. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Mark examined the area closely, comparing it to the photograph. After several minutes of searching, he pointed to a patch of soil that seemed slightly sunken compared to the surrounding ground. Here, he said firmly, this is where we dig. As they began to excavate, the mood grew somber. Each thrust of the shovel into the damp earth felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of history itself pressed down on them. Father O'Connell recited quiet prayers under his breath while Sarah clutched her arms tightly around herself. Unable to watch but unable to look away. It wasn't long before the shovel struck something solid again. This time, it wasn't metal. It was bone. The group froze, their breath catching in unison. Carefully, Mark knelt down and brushed away the dirt, revealing fragments of what appeared to be human remains. A collective gasp escaped the group as the horrifying reality sank in. Thomas Reed had indeed been buried here, his body concealed for decades. Forensic experts arrived later that day to take over the excavation. Preliminary tests confirmed that the remains belonged to Thomas Reed, whose disappearance had been ruled accidental in the 1950s. The truth was far darker. He had been murdered, likely by those he had accused of wrongdoing. Further investigation revealed evidence linking several prominent families in town to the crimes detailed in his letters, crimes that spanned generations. For the townsfolk, the revelation was devastating. Long-held reputations crumbled overnight as arrests were made and secrets spilled into the open. People who had lived side by side for years now viewed each other with suspicion and mistrust. The once idyllic town was fractured, its foundation shaken by the weight of its own past. Yet amidst the chaos there was also hope. Emily's nightmares stopped almost immediately after the discovery. She no longer pointed at the floor during services, her bright smile returning as if a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Whether she had somehow sensed Thomas's presence or simply reacted to the lingering energy of the church, no one could say for sure. What mattered most was that justice had finally been served, not just for Thomas, but for the entire community. As the dust settled and healing began, the people of St. Mary's vowed never to forget the lessons learned. They rebuilt not only their church but also their trust in one another, determined to ensure that such darkness would never take root again. And through it all, Emily remained a symbol of courage, a reminder that even the smallest voices could uncover the deepest truths. As the investigation unfolded, Detective Mark Harris began to notice something peculiar about Emily's connection to Thomas Reed. While the townsfolk were reeling from the revelations, Emily seemed almost lighter. The tension that had gripped her small frame during church services was gone, replaced by a calmness that hadn't been there before. Her parents noticed it too. She laughed more freely at home, played outside with her friends without hesitation, and even started sleeping soundly through the night, a stark contrast to the restless nights filled with murmured words and sudden awakenings. Curious about this change, Mark decided to speak with Emily directly. He approached her one afternoon when she was playing in her backyard, tossing a ball back and forth with her older brother. Crouching down to her level, he gave her a warm smile. "Hey, Emily," he said gently. "Can I ask you something about the church?" Emily stopped mid-throw and looked at him, her big brown eyes studying his face carefully. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether to answer. Then, clutching her ball tightly against her chest, she nodded. "Do you remember pointing at the floor in church?" Mark asked. "Why did you do that? Did you see something?" Emily hesitated, biting her lip as though trying to find the right words. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't see anything, but I felt it." "Felt what?" Mark pressed softly, not wanting to overwhelm her. "It was like someone was calling me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not with words, but like a feeling, like they needed help. She paused, then added, "It wasn't scary, not really, just important." Mark exchanged a glance with Sarah, who stood nearby watching the conversation intently. Her hands trembled slightly as she listened to her daughter's explanation. It sounded impossible. How could an 8-year-old girl sense the presence of a man buried beneath the church for decades? Yet the timing of everything, the discovery of Thomas Reed's remains, the letters detailing his plight, and Emily's behavior, was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Later that evening, Mark met with Father O'Connell to discuss Emily's statement. The priest sat quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of his Bible as he absorbed the detective's words. "Children have always been closer to the divine," Father O'Connell mused after a long silence. Perhaps Emily sensed Thomas's spirit because he wanted his story told. Maybe she was chosen to help bring justice where none existed. Though skeptical of supernatural explanations, Mark couldn't deny the logic behind the idea. Whether it was intuition, fate, or something beyond human understanding, Emily had played a vital role in uncovering the truth. But one question still lingered. Why now? Why had Thomas's call reached Emily decades after his death? The answer came unexpectedly during a follow-up review of the documents found in the metal box. Among the faded letters and photographs, Mark discovered a journal entry written by Thomas Reed shortly before his disappearance. In it, he described a recurring dream, a vision of a young girl standing in the church, pointing at the floor where his evidence was hidden. At the time, Thomas had dismissed it as stress-induced imagination, but he ended the entry with a poignant note. "If anyone can hear me, let them listen. Let them look where no one dares to search." Reading those words sent chills down Mark's spine. Could Thomas have somehow reached out across time, guiding Emily to the very spot where his secrets lay buried? Or was it simply a remarkable alignment of events, a child's instincts leading her to uncover what others had overlooked? Either way, the connection between Emily and Thomas was undeniable and deeply moving. With this new insight, Mark and Father O'Connell decided to hold a private service near the oak trees where Thomas's remains had been found. They invited only a handful of trusted parishioners, including Emily and her family. As Father O'Connell spoke prayers of remembrance and forgiveness, Emily stood quietly beside her mother, her gaze fixed on the ground where Thomas had rested for so many years. When the ceremony concluded, she walked forward and placed a single, white flower on the freshly covered soil. No one spoke as she did this. They didn't need to. Everyone present understood that Emily had been the bridge between the past and the present, ensuring that Thomas Reed's voice would finally be heard. And though the mystery of how she had connected with him might never fully be explained, the discovery of Thomas Reed's remains and the evidence hidden beneath the church sent shockwaves through the town. unraveling decades of carefully concealed secrets. Detective Mark Harris worked tirelessly alongside law enforcement officials to piece together the full scope of the crimes outlined in Thomas's letters. What they uncovered was staggering, a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the walls of St. Mary's Church. Members of influential families, people who had been pillars of the community, were implicated in illegal activities ranging from embezzlement to blackmail and even murder. As arrests were made, the town found itself divided. Some residents were outraged, demanding justice for the victims whose lives had been destroyed by greed and betrayal. Others struggled to reconcile the accusations with their memories of neighbors and friends they had trusted for years. The once close-knit community became fractured, with whispers and glares replacing friendly greetings on the streets. For Emily's family, the unfolding drama felt both distant and deeply personal. While Sarah and her husband tried to shield Emily from the chaos, it was impossible to ignore the impact it had on everyone around them. Neighbors who had once waved warmly now avoided eye contact, embarrassed or ashamed. Even Emily's schoolmates seemed confused, asking questions about why certain families weren't attending church anymore. Despite the turmoil, there was a sense of relief that the truth had finally come to light. Father O'Connell played a crucial role in guiding the congregation through this difficult time. He held special services focused on healing and forgiveness, urging the townsfolk to confront their shared history rather than bury it again. "We cannot undo the past," he said during one sermon, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But we can choose how we move forward. Let us honor Thomas Reed's memory by committing ourselves to honesty, accountability, and compassion." Meanwhile, Emily remained at the center of the story, not as a victim but as a symbol of hope. People began referring to her as the girl who pointed the way, marveling at how her seemingly inexplicable actions had led to the exposure of such profound wrongdoing. Reporters from nearby cities arrived, eager to interview her parents and document the remarkable events. But Sarah politely declined all requests, determined to protect her daughter's privacy. "Emily is just a child," she told Mark firmly. "She doesn't need to carry the weight of this story on her shoulders." Still, the town couldn't help but reflect on the significance of Emily's role. Her innocence and intuition had cut through layers of deception, forcing the community to confront its darkest truths. For many, it served as a reminder that justice often comes from unexpected places, and sometimes, the purest voices are the ones that break the silence. The legal proceedings unfolded. Several individuals confessed to their involvement in the crimes, hoping for leniency. Others fought the charges, dragging the case into lengthy trials. Through it all, Thomas Reed's name was cleared, and his bravery in standing up against corruption was honored. A small plaque was placed near the oak trees behind the church, commemorating his courage and ensuring that future generations would remember his sacrifice. Slowly, life in the town began to stabilize. The initial shock gave way to a cautious optimism as people worked to rebuild trust and mend relationships. Community meetings were held to discuss transparency and accountability, and new safeguards were implemented to prevent similar abuses of power in the future. It wasn't an easy process, but the collective effort showed that the town was willing to learn from its mistakes. For Emily, the changes were subtle, yet profound. She no longer woke up in the middle of the night crying or stared blankly at the floor during church services. Instead, she laughed freely, played outside without hesitation, and greeted each day with the boundless energy of a typical 8-year-old. Though she didn't fully understand the magnitude of what she had helped uncover, she sensed that something important had shifted, not just for her family, but for everyone around her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the quiet town, Sarah stood on her porch watching Emily chase fireflies in the yard. Mark approached, carrying a folder with updates on the investigation. After exchanging pleasantries, he glanced toward Emily and smiled. "She did something extraordinary," he said softly. "Something none of us could have done." Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I know," she replied. "And I hope she never loses that light inside her, the one that led us all to the truth." In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of twilight and the promise of renewal. It was clear that the town's journey toward healing had only just begun. But thanks to Emily's courage and Thomas Reed's enduring legacy, they were finally on the right path. Months passed, and the once troubled town began to breathe easier. The trials of those implicated in the crimes had concluded, bringing a mix of convictions, guilty pleas, and harsh sentences. Justice, though delayed for decades, had finally been served. For the first time in years, the people of St. Mary's Church could walk into their sanctuary without feeling the shadow of secrets lurking beneath its ancient floors. The floorboards where Emily had pointed so insistently were repaired and polished, but the memory of what lay below them lingered, a reminder of both the darkness that had festered and the light that had ultimately prevailed. Father O'Connell played a pivotal role in guiding the congregation through this period of healing. He organized weekly meetings focused on reflection and reconciliation, encouraging open dialogue about the pain and mistrust that still lingered among some families. "We cannot erase the past," he often said, his voice filled with quiet resolve, "but we can choose to build something better from it." Slowly, the townsfolk began to rebuild, not just their relationships but also their faith in one another. Acts of kindness replaced suspicion, and conversations became warmer, more genuine. Emily, now free from the strange compulsion that had gripped her for so long, returned to being the bright, curious child she'd always been. She no longer pointed at the floor during services or woke up crying in the middle of the night. Her dreams, once haunted by vague whispers and unseen hands, gave way to peaceful slumber. To her parents' relief, she seemed blissfully unaware of the profound impact she'd had on the entire community. To Emily, life was simple again: school, playtime, and laughter with friends. But others didn't forget. The plaque near the cluster of oak trees behind the church became a place of quiet pilgrimage for many. Inscribed with Thomas Reed's name and a short message honoring his courage, it served as a testament to the power of truth and justice. On sunny afternoons, visitors would leave flowers or pause for a moment of silent reflection. Some whispered prayers. Others simply stood there letting the weight of history settle over them. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about how far the town had come. One Sunday morning, Father O'Connell held a special service dedicated to Thomas Reed. The church was packed, not just with regular attendees but also with newcomers who had heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. As sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the wooden pews, Father O'Connell delivered a heartfelt sermon about redemption and renewal. "Thomas Reed risked everything to expose the truth," he said, his voice echoing softly in the hushed room. And though his voice was silenced, it found a way to reach us, through the innocence of a child. At the end of the service, Emily stepped forward shyly, holding a single white rose. With Sarah and Mark watching proudly from the front pew, she placed the flower gently on the altar before returning to her seat. No one clapped or cheered. It wasn't necessary. The act itself carried a quiet dignity that resonated deeply with everyone present. Tears glistened in many eyes, including Father O'Connell's, as he blessed the congregation and dismissed them with words of hope. In the weeks that followed, the town continued to heal. New leaders emerged within the community, committed to transparency and integrity. Families affected by the scandal worked to restore their reputations, while others sought forgiveness for the roles they, or their ancestors, had played in perpetuating the lies. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. For Emily, life moved on much as it had before, but with subtle differences. Neighbors greeted her with warm smiles, calling her our little hero when they thought she wasn't listening. Teachers praised her creativity, noting how she seemed to see the world differently than other children. And though she didn't understand why people treated her with such admiration, she accepted it graciously, her cheerful spirit remaining unchanged. As winter approached, blanketing the hills around the town in soft snow, the air felt lighter, freer. The old church stood tall against the crisp blue sky, its bell ringing out a melody of unity and hope. Inside, the congregation sang hymns with renewed fervor, their voices blending harmoniously. Among them sat Emily, her face glowing with innocence, blissfully unaware of the legacy she had helped create. The town would never forget the events that had shaken it to its core, or the little girl who had unknowingly guided them toward the light.